They found her sitting on a rock. Not crying, not running, just sitting the way a child sits when she has already processed the worst thing and come out the other side of it into a strange, flat country where nothing surprises her anymore. She was perhaps 6 years old. Her skin was the gray-green of deep river stone, her tusks barely nubs above her lower lip, and her hair was pulled into a braid that someone else had done for her, neat and careful, now caked with ash at the ends. She was watching the smoke. Behind her, what had been a village of 40 orc families was still burning. Captain Myra Vess pulled her horse up and looked down at the child for a long moment. She had ridden hard from the Eastern Patrol Post, following the smoke column the way you followed any bad news, because ignoring it made it worse. The punitive column that had done this work was long gone, 3 hours, maybe 4. The smoke said the attack had been at dawn. The girl did not look up at the sound of hooves. "She's the only one," said Corporal Drent beside her. He had already ridden a circuit of the village perimeter. His face was the color of old bone. "The only one left standing, I mean." Vess dismounted. She walked to the rock and crouched so she was at the child's eye level. Up close, the girl's eyes were amber gold, the kind of color you didn't see much in orc children, a sign of mixed lineage somewhere, or just chance. The eyes were dry. The amber was very steady. "Hey," Vess said in Orcish, which she spoke badly. "Are you hurt?" The girl looked at her. A long assessment. Children did this, weighed you fast, decided whether you were safe, but this one did it with a particular thoroughness, the way a very old person does, someone who has been lied to by enough faces to develop a method. "No," the girl said. "What's your name?" A pause. "Zura." "Zura." Vess held out her hand, palm up, which was the orc gesture for offering. The girl studied the palm, did not take it, but she did, after a moment, stand up from the rock. She was tiny. She walked like she was not tiny. Vess brought her to the horse and lifted her up. The girl did not flinch or make a sound. She sat in front of Vess in the saddle and gripped the pommel with both small fists and looked ahead, at the road, with that same strange composure. Drent watched them go and then looked back at the burning village and thought about what he was going to write in his report, and how many things there were in it that could not be said plainly. The road west was long. The girl did not sleep, but she did not speak much either. Once, around midday, she asked what the name of the road was, and Vess told her, and she repeated it carefully under her breath, the way she was going to repeat everything she was told, as if she were taking notes inside herself, building a map. Once, an hour before the city gates, she asked if it was going to be safe. Vess thought about how to answer that honestly. "Yes," she said, "I'll make sure of it." The girl nodded once, processing this, and then looked back at the road ahead. They rode through the city gates at sunset. The problem of what to do with her arrived before they did. Vess sent a rider ahead, which meant word reached the palace garrison before she was halfway there, which meant that by the time she rode through the outer gate with one orc child sitting in front of her on a cavalry horse, the garrison commander was waiting in the yard with 4 staff officers, and a look on his face that suggested the next 3 hours of his life were going to be deeply unpleasant. "Captain," Commander House said, looking at Zura. "That is an orc child." "Yes, sir." "From the Marwick village incident." "The only survivor, sir." House breathed through his nose. He was a practical man, which meant he understood immediately that he could not send this child back. Back to what? The smoking rubble of a village that the High Council's punitive column had erased on grounds that were, in Vess's private opinion and in the growing public opinion of people who had actually fought in the war and knew what it had cost, approximately as legitimate as a forgery. There was a 3-year-old armistice. There were terms. "The king," House said finally, not as a question, just as a recognition of how this would have to go. "Yes, sir," Vess said. "He is going to be very interested in the name of the column commander." "I imagine, sir." House looked at Zura again. The girl looked back at him with complete equanimity. He cleared his throat. See that she's fed and cleaned up. And Vess, no one talks to her directly until His Majesty has seen her. No frightening her with council functionaries or questioners. Understood. Good. House paused. She have a name? Zura, sir. He nodded very slightly and went inside. Vess lifted the girl down from the horse and walked her toward the inner building, through the garrison yard where 6 or 8 soldiers had found various tasks that needed doing right there, right then, in positions that allowed clear views of the new arrival. Zura walked through this without acknowledging it, though Vess had the distinct impression she was cataloging every face. The kitchen fed her. She ate 3 bread rolls, a bowl of stew, and a piece of dried fruit in that order with full concentration. The kitchen maid who watched her do this reported later to 3 different people, with increasing enthusiasm, that she was the most serious eater she had ever seen in her life. The king was in the war room. He was in the war room in the way that people are in rooms they have used as a retreat so long that the room has taken on their shape, the way an old chair develops a specific hollow. King Edric Voss of the Consolidated Marches was 58 years old, built like someone had started with the intention of making a larger man, and then had life repeatedly subtract pieces. A finger gone at the second knuckle on his left hand, a long scar along the jawline, a deep hitch in his left knee from a wound at the Battle of Irongate that had never healed properly. His hair had gone white somewhere in the 4th year of the war, all at once, the way it sometimes did when the thing that was burning had been burning long enough. He was standing at the northern map when Vess entered. He did not turn around immediately. "Captain Vess," he said, "House tells me you have something that belongs to no one." "Yes, Majesty." He turned then. He was carrying a cup of tea gone cold. The way he often was, he drank it cold without noticing, the way people do when they are thinking about too many other things to remember that beverages have temperatures. He looked at Vess, registered the situation with the efficient scanning of a man who had read 10,000 tactical reports, and then looked at the small figure standing beside her. Zura was clean now, her braid redone by a patient woman in the garrison who had a daughter about her age, and had done it with the same practiced care that was visible in the original. She was wearing a borrowed Page's shirt that came to her knees. She had eaten 3 bread rolls with the focused efficiency of someone working through a problem. She had not cried. She had not spoken, except to answer direct questions with single words. She was looking at the king with those amber eyes. Edric Voss set down his cold tea. He walked across the room slowly, the way you approach something you are not yet certain of, and he lowered himself carefully to one knee, his bad knee, which cost him, though he did not show it until he was at the child's height, close enough that she could have reached out and touched his face. She studied him. He studied her. "Zura," he said. She tilted her head. "You know my name." "Someone told me." "Someone told you other things too," she said, which was not a question. The amber eyes moved briefly to Vess and back. "About the village." He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The girl processed this. She looked at the northern map behind him, and then at his scarred hands, and then at his face. Something in the examination felt almost like she was checking her own conclusion against the evidence. Then, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned that certain things require diplomacy, "Are you the most important person here?" "Yes." "Then you're the one who decides what happens to me." "Yes." She nodded very slightly. "Okay." She looked at him for another moment with that thorough assessment. Then she said, in the matter-of-fact tone of a child stating a correct answer, "You look like my grandfather." Edric Voss had commanded armies. He had negotiated peace treaties with beings who considered humans a peripheral species. He had stood at the front of a battle line while artillery fell close enough to feel in the chest. He had buried his son and stood over the grave without crying, because there was no one else who could afford to show that, and he had made himself into someone who could afford not to. He was not entirely prepared for this. "Do I?" he said. He had the same face, Zura said. The amber was very calm. "Tired but not mean. Those are different." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, those are different." He rose carefully and he looked at Vess. "She stays. Find her a proper room, not the servant quarters, and have the council notified that I will receive them tomorrow morning, not tonight." A pause. "Tonight I am unavailable." Vess saluted. He looked back down at Zura. "Are you tired?" She appeared to consider this honestly. "A little." "Come on then." And he walked with her down the corridor toward the family wing, and she walked beside him, and a page who happened to be passing pressed himself against the wall and stared, and neither of them paid him any attention. Her room was in the family wing, 3 doors down from the king's own, which was a detail that made the rounds of the palace staff by the following morning, with the speed and thoroughness of news that people understand is significant before they can articulate why. It was a good room. High windows, a proper bed, a writing table, a shelf that was currently empty. By the second morning, someone had put a rug on the stone floor because the nights were cold. By the third morning, there was a pillow on the window seat. No one admitted doing either of these things, but the pillow was goose down and had clearly come from the household linen stores, and the rug had the particular faded pattern of the kind that came from the palace's deep storage. Not new, not showy, just warm. Zura did not comment on the additions, but the second morning the guard on the wing rotation found, propped against the wall beside his post, a small drawing on a scrap of parchment. It was, unmistakably, a dog. He had mentioned in passing while walking the girl to the dining room that he had a dog at home. He showed the drawing to his wife when he got home that evening, and she said it was actually quite good, and he put it in the box on the mantel where he kept the things he didn't want to lose. She was studying them all. That was the first thing you noticed if you were paying attention. Not suspiciously, not with the wariness of someone looking for threats, though that was there too, low and constant, the vigilance of someone who had learned early that mornings could change without warning. What she was doing was more like the natural data collection of an extremely alert intelligence that had been dropped into a new environment and was building its model as fast as it could. She learned the palace layout in 4 days. By the end of the first week, she knew the names of every person she had spoken to, the names of their family members they had mentioned, their preferences and habits. She did not weaponize this information. She simply had it, carefully filed away, and occasionally referred to it in ways that startled people, asking after Guardsman Pellin's old hunting dog by name, asking the kitchen maid whether her sister's ankle had healed. Within 2 weeks she could make herself understood in common. Within a month she was speaking in full, grammatically correct sentences, with the slightly formal diction of someone learning a language from books and serious adults. She had not, as far as anyone could tell, been formally taught. She had simply listened and borrowed and reconstructed the language from its components the way you might reassemble a mechanism, by understanding how each part worked. The tutor, when the king eventually asked him to assess her, looked slightly dazed when he came out of the session. He wrote in his report that her mind was remarkable and that he was uncertain who would be teaching whom. The court was not exactly hostile. Hostility would have been cleaner. What it was deeply uncomfortable in a way that people who are deeply uncomfortable tend to externalize as practical concern. Every concern was framed as reasonableness. Every objection was dressed in the language of policy and precedent and the terms of the armistice. No one in the High Council in those first days said the simple thing they were feeling, which was, there is an orc child in the palace, and it unsettles something old in us, something we have been feeding for 20 years of war and 3 years of peace that doesn't feel like peace, and we do not know what to do with that unease. Lord Kalen said it in code, as he said most things. The presence of a non-human ward of the crown, he said, in the second council session on the matter, presents a number of treaty interpretation questions that require formal legal review. Then begin the review, Edric said. It may take some time. It may. Kalen paused. He was a compact man, precise in his dress, silver-haired, with eyes the color of river slate. He had lost his younger brother at Irongate. He had never, in 3 years of armistice, fully come out of the war. Some people didn't. The war became the last place they'd felt certain, and the peace just felt like confusion with better food. Majesty, there is also the question of how the Northern Orc Confederation will interpret the Crown's relationship with a child who survived a punitive strike, Edric said, that was carried out in violation of the armistice terms, by a column acting under orders I did not authorize. Yes, I am aware of how the Confederation will interpret it. He kept his voice level. Lord Kalen, I will be very clear. I am not asking the Council's permission to house one child who lost her family in an illegal strike. I am informing the Council that I have done so. The review of treaty interpretation is welcome. It should also include, in my view, a full review of who authorized that column. The silence in the chamber was very complete. Kalen said carefully, "The child is still, technically, a citizen of the Orc Dominion." The Orc Dominion dissolved its eastern territories 2 years ago as part of the armistice terms, Edric said. She has no citizenship. She has no family. She has no home. She has, at this moment, the palace. That's what she has. He looked around the table. Does anyone have something of substance to add? Lord Pell, at the far end of the table, was studying the woodgrain with elaborate interest. No one else spoke. Zura learned things quickly. This was the first thing the palace staff noticed, the thing that made it difficult to maintain even the most comfortable prejudices, because it required you to pay attention to her, and paying attention to her made the prejudices seem stupid rather than merely wrong, which was worse. She picked up common faster than anyone expected. She learned which corridors were used by whom at which hours. She learned the names of every guard on the family wing rotation and what they liked to talk about. She moved through the palace with a kind of quiet purposefulness, taking the measure of things. She was funny, though she did not know she was funny. Her observations were simply accurate, and accuracy about human behavior is often hilarious when it comes from outside. She told the head housekeeper in month 2 that the great hall chandelier looked like someone had tried to make a forest and then panicked. The housekeeper had laughed for the first time in months, and then stood in the great hall doorway afterward looking at the chandelier and thinking that it genuinely did look like that, and wondering how she had not seen it before. She started appearing in the family dining room, where the king took his evening meals. Not intruding, she had an instinct for the line. She would appear at the doorway, confirm he was there, and either come in or drift away depending on whether he seemed like he was in the middle of something that required being alone. Edric noticed this. He said nothing about it. He began, after a while, leaving the door open, and there would be a second setting at the table in the same place every evening when she arrived, placed there by kitchen staff who had also noticed and made their own quiet decisions. She sat across from him at the table with her food and she ate, and he read his dispatches, and neither of them felt required to talk. When they did talk, she asked questions that were exactly as direct as her first ones. What happened at Irongate? He looked up from his dispatch. It was a battle. I know, my grandfather talked about it. He was there. She turned her bread over in her hands. He said it was very bad for both sides. That's accurate. Were you there? Yes. She looked at him. Do you feel bad about it? He set down the dispatch. This was the question people spent entire diplomatic careers avoiding, layering in qualifications and counter-narratives until the honest answer was buried so deep it couldn't breathe. Yes, he said, not for fighting, for the cost. What does that mean? It means when you fight a war, there are things you have to spend that you can't get back. People, time, parts of yourself. He paused. Whether the war was right or not, the cost is real either way, and the cost at Iron Gate was very high. Zura was quiet for a moment, thinking this through with the visible concentration she brought to problems. The way she worked on her lesson texts, completely, unhurried, certain that the answer existed and that effort would locate it. My grandfather said the worst thing wasn't who won, she said. He said the worst thing was everyone forgot how many of both sides there were afterward, just remembered the number of their own. Edric looked at her for a long moment. Your grandfather, he said, was a wise man. She nodded, yes. Then, he looked like you. She paused, seeming to remember she'd said this before. I don't mean he looked like you exactly. I mean he had the same thing in his face. He had seen a lot of things and it made him quiet, not mean. You've said that before. It's still true. He picked up his dispatch again, but he wasn't really reading it anymore. The child moved through the palace. The palace moved around her. The staff adapted fastest, which was always the way with staff. They were practical people dealing with practical realities, and the practical reality was that she was there. She was clearly staying, and she was someone you could not help paying attention to once you started. She fixed things. This was not something anyone had asked her to do. She simply noticed when things needed fixing. A sticking door hinge that the housekeeping had deferred for 2 months, which she solved by borrowing a small pot of grease from the stable and working it into the hinge with a piece of cloth. A leaking water barrel in the east corridor that she reported to the right person by locating that person rather than waiting for the right person to come to her. A disagreement between 2 of the kitchen staff over a scheduling matter that she resolved by pointing out, with complete impartiality, that both of them were half right, which was, the head cook later admitted, more sophisticated mediation than she'd seen from council members twice their age. She was not trying to be useful. She simply could not see a problem without working on it. This was, Edric would eventually understand, what her grandfather had made her, someone who looked at the world as a series of things that could be improved by paying attention and applying effort. It was not an orc trait or a human trait. It was just hers. The council adapted slowest, in the way that people adapt slowly when changing requires abandoning a position they have publicly taken. Kaelan watched all of this from the middle distance and said little, in the way of a man who is calculating. He had people in the palace. He knew which rooms she used, which routes she walked, how many hours she spent with the king. He knew that the king had quietly asked the palace's head tutor to assess her for an education program. He knew that the first assessment had returned words like remarkable and exceptional. He knew that she had, in her now fluent common, begun to respond to visiting emissaries with the kind of courteous, well-informed questions that suggested she was paying very close attention to the diplomatic context she was living inside. He brought this to a private meeting with 3 other council members in the 2nd month. She is not what she was introduced to us as, he said. A child, Lord Pell said, who was old and direct. An incidental, Kaelan spread his hands. She is being educated at crown expense. She is eating in the family dining room. The king has begun to introduce her to visiting emissaries as a member of my household. Lord Fenwick had an emissary from the Eastern Trade Guilds last week, and the girl participated in the conversation about border customs without being asked. Did she say anything useful? Fenwick asked. That is not the point. The emissary seemed to think it was. He mentioned her in his report back to the guild. He described her as Fenwick consulted a small note, a remarkably clear-minded young person. Kaelan looked at him steadily. The Northern Orc Confederation is noting her presence in their diplomatic dispatches. Good, Pell said, and the word dropped into the room like a stone into water. Everyone looked at him. Good, he said again, unmoved. If the Northern Orc Confederation is noting it, then they are noting that the human king kept one surviving orc child safe after an illegal punitive strike on a civilian village. That seems, to me, like exactly the kind of thing we should want them to be noting. The kind of thing that makes the next 3 years of peace more durable than the last 3. He stood up. I'll see myself out. After he left, Kalen sat for a moment in the particular stillness of someone revising a plan. The vote came in the 3rd month. It was framed as a procedural matter, an establishment of official ward status, with terms which was technically what it was. But Edric understood what it was, because he had been in enough rooms where the real question was different from the stated one. The stated question was whether to formalize the girl's status under the Crown's protection. The real question was whether the council wanted to pick this fight with him, and whether they thought they could win it, and what winning even looked like. Kalen called for a formal vote the morning after the king's birthday. The timing was not accidental. The king's birthday had been celebrated in the palace for the first time in 4 years. The last 3 had passed without ceremony, since his son Aldrich had died 10 days before the 3rd one, and the 2 after that, Edric had simply not been willing. There was nothing to mark with a celebration when the thing that had been subtracted from you was still so loud. But this year, Vess had suggested it quietly, and the housekeeper had quietly agreed, and the kitchen had quietly begun planning, and he had not said no, which was as close to yes as he could get. There had been a dinner. There had been the household staff and the personal guard, and a handful of council members who were, individually, decent people even when collectively they made worse decisions. There had been wine, and there had been the housekeeper's famous pastry, and there had been, at the end of the table, Zura, in a proper dress that the seamstress had made to her exact measurements, deep green, simply cut, with a small silver clasp at the collar that she had chosen herself from the options laid out for her, with the same deliberateness she brought to everything. She had eaten what was in front of her with that focused efficiency. She had listened to the conversation around the table with the thoroughness of someone who understood that conversations contained more information than their words. She had once, very quietly, asked Guardsman Pellin about the hunting dog, and he had told her about it at length, and she had listened as if hunting dogs were the most important subject in the room, which for Pellin they were. Somewhere in the middle of the evening, when the formal part was over and things had loosened into conversation, she had looked down the table at the king and said, perfectly clearly in her precise new common, "Happy birthday, grandfather." The table had gone absolutely quiet. Edric had looked at her for a moment. The amber eyes were entirely steady, entirely clear, saying simply, "This is the correct word and I know it and I have decided to say it out loud." "Thank you, Zura," he said. And the table, after another moment, had gone back to its conversation, but it was a different conversation than before. Something had shifted in the room the way things shift when a true thing is said out loud after too long being said only in private. Pellin was looking at the ceiling. The housekeeper had found something to attend to at the far end of the table. Fenwick, who had not expected to feel anything about any of this, was studying his wine glass with more concentration than the wine warranted. Kalen had noted the shift. His face had given nothing away. But he had noted it because Kalen always noted things. 3 days later she was gone. Not gone, she had not run. She had been moved. Edric learned this from Captain Vess, who had learned it from a guard she trusted on the eastern wing, who had seen 2 of Kalen's household attachés walking a small figure toward the lower guest quarters of the council building at the 7th bell of the night. She had not been harmed. Edric confirmed this first before anything else because it was the thing that mattered first. She was in the guest rooms. She had food and water and a lamp. She was not hurt. The message from Kalen arrived at the same time. It was carefully worded, as all of Kalen's messages were. It acknowledged that the ward's presence in the main palace had become, in the Lord's view, a source of growing diplomatic and domestic complication. It noted that the formal vote on her status was scheduled for the following morning, and that in the interests of conducting that vote without the appearance of undue crown pressure, a temporary relocation pending the outcome seemed appropriate. It noted that the girl had been moved with care and courtesy. It suggested that the king, in his well-known wisdom, would see the reasonableness of this. Edric read the message. He set it down. He sat for a moment in the war room, by the northern map. In the same position he'd been in the evening, Vess brought the girl to him. He thought about Kalen, whom he had known for 15 years and never liked but had always respected as a capable man, a man who understood power and how to apply it. He thought about what Kalen was actually doing here, which was not, despite the careful language, about treaty interpretation or procedural propriety. It was about what the birthday table moment had told him, that the thing Kalen had expected to remain manageable had become, in one sentence spoken by a 6-year-old, something harder to manage. That the girl had stopped being a diplomatic complication and become a person, visibly, in front of a room full of witnesses, and that this made her more dangerous to certain positions, not less. He thought about a man who had lost his brother at Irongate and never come home from it. He thought about a girl sitting on a rock watching smoke. Then he put on his coat and went to the council building. He did not take guards, he did not send word ahead. He walked there himself, through the inner corridors of the palace complex, in the cold of the late night, with his coat and his bad knee aching from the chill the way it always did, and his face set in the expression that the few surviving veterans of Irongate who'd served under him could have identified and described in detail to anyone who asked. The expression of a man who has decided something completely and is no longer interested in the discussion part. He was let through the council building gate without question because he was the king, and there are limits, even in a political power struggle, to certain gestures. He found the guest rooms, he knocked. A pause, a longer pause than it should have taken, then her voice carefully controlled. "Who is it?" "Edric." Another pause, the sound of small feet on stone floor, then the door opened. She looked up at him. She was in her dress from the birthday dinner which she had apparently been wearing when they moved her, and her braid was coming loose, and she had clearly not been sleeping. Her eyes were dry. But her face, for the first time since he had known her, showed the edge of something that was not composure, a thinness at the edges, a held quality, the face of someone who has been keeping it together with a lot of effort, and is very glad that something has come along to make the effort slightly less necessary. "I knew you'd come," she said. "Did you?" "Yes." She stepped back to let him in. The room was plain, a guest room without much character, a lamp burning on the table. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him. "They thought I'd be scared." "Are you?" She considered this with her usual honesty. A little, not very. She folded her hands in her lap, which was something she did when she was steadying herself, he had noticed. "Are you angry?" "Yes." "At me?" He looked at her. "No, Zura, not at you." "At them?" "Yes." She nodded slowly, processing the configuration. Then, "What are you going to do?" He sat down in the single chair across from her, his bad knee making itself known. And he looked at her in the lamplight, and he thought about what a man did when the thing he was protecting was very small and very clear, and the opposition was complex and political, and dressed in the language of reason. The way opposition always was when it understood that it could not win on the merits. "I'm going to take you home," he said. "To the palace?" "Yes." And then we are going to resolve this," he said it flatly. "Tonight." She looked at him for a long moment, and he thought, not for the first time, about her grandfather, whoever that man had been, some elder of the eastern villages, a man who had fought at Irongate and come home and built something from what was left of himself, and raised his family and died in his own village when the punitive column came at dawn. A man who had taught his granddaughter the difference between tired and mean. A man who had left a 6-year-old girl sitting on a rock watching the smoke, so calm that a cavalry captain had thought, at first, that she must be in shock, until the amber eyes focused on her, and she understood that she was simply looking at someone who had already measured the distance of what she'd lost and decided, in the same moment, to keep going. "Okay," Zura said. She stood up and she straightened her dress, which she did seriously as if the straightening mattered. Then she looked up at him. "Can we go?" "Yes," he said. She walked to him and took his hand, which she had not done before. Not like this. Not with the directness of someone who has calculated the distance between 2 points and decided to close it. And they walked out of the guest room and down the corridor of the council building and through the gate. The king and the 6-year-old orc girl. And the gate guards watched them pass and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The council was convened at the 2nd hour of the morning. Not every member was pleased about this. Not every member was awake at the 2nd hour of the morning in a way that implied functioning judgment. The great chamber was lit by torchlight, and there was the smell of sleep and candle wax and old stone, and Lord Kaelan sat at his place with the controlled stillness of a man who has been outmaneuvered on timing, but has not yet decided whether the position itself is lost. Edric stood. He did not sit for this. He stood at the head of the council table with his hands at his sides, and his face arranged into the configuration that the veterans would have recognized, and he spoke without theatrics, because he never needed them when he was saying something true. He spoke about the armistice. He spoke about its terms in specific language, because he had written parts of those terms himself, and he knew them better than most of the council and better, certainly, than Kaelan, who had not been at the table that day. He spoke about the punitive column and what it had done, and the legal weight of that action under the terms they had signed, and what it meant for the peace, and for the 3 years of quiet that had followed it, and more importantly for the prospect of more years of quiet after this one. He spoke about the Northern Orc Confederation's diplomatic communications, which Lord Pell had noted, and which Kaelan had thought to use as a threat, and which were, in fact, documentation of an opportunity that came along rarely in the history of two peoples who had been hurting each other for longer than most of the people in this room had been alive. He spoke about what the Confederation was watching for. He spoke for 20 minutes without stopping, in the level tone of a man who does not need volume because the substance carries itself. And when he was done with that, he said the last thing. 3 years ago, he said, I signed the armistice. I signed it because the war was over, because both sides had paid more than they could afford, and because the only thing left worth doing was stopping. I signed it across a table that smelled of blood, with a man I did not like, while my son was buried 3 weeks in the ground. He paused. I have been careful in the 3 years since not to find excuses to undo that signature. I have been careful not to let grief become policy, and not to let the people in this room who are still living inside the war make decisions for those of us who have tried to come out of it. The chamber was very quiet. This girl, he said, came into this palace with nothing. She walked through my halls and learned the names of my guards and sat at my table and asked me questions I didn't have good enough answers to, and she called me grandfather in front of every person at my birthday table, and she meant it, and I meant it back. His voice had not risen. It stayed level, which was more difficult, and which they all knew. I am not asking this council's permission to keep her. I am telling this council that she is my ward formally, under the Crown's protection, and that the review of her status is concluded as of tonight, in my favor. He looked at Kaelan. The river slate eyes held his steadily. I would also like the names of the officers who commanded the punitive column on the eastern border, he said. By tomorrow morning. Kaelan was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was, for him, a long time. You'll have them, he said. Something moved behind his eyes, not defeat, which would have been too simple and too clean, but revision. The recalculation of a practical man who understands when a position is no longer tenable, not because the opposition is stronger, but because the ground itself has shifted and there is no position left to hold. Lord Pell, at the far end of the table, appeared to be studying the ceiling with the specific focused attention of a man who is in fact very pleased about something and does not want to let it show until the meeting is adjourned. The vote was 3-1 in favor. Zura was waiting outside the chamber with Captain Vess, who had arrived without being asked, which was the thing about Vess. She was sitting on the stone bench in the antechamber with her hands in her lap and her braids still half undone, and she looked up when Edric came through the door. She read his face the way she read everything, quickly and completely, with the full attention of someone who has learned that faces contain more information than words. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when she had been correct about something she already believed. She slipped her hand into his again, and they walked back through the palace, through the torchlit corridors and the cold night stone, past the guard posts where Pellin and the others stood their watches, toward the family wing and the room with the empty shelf and the warm rug and the pillow on the window seat that no one had admitted putting there. "What will happen to Lord Kalen?" she asked as they walked. "Nothing yet. He'll wait and watch and decide if there's another angle." "Is there?" "There's always another angle for men like him." He paused. "But this one is closed." She thought about this. He lost someone in the war. His brother. A long pause, the sound of their footsteps, her smaller ones between his uneven ones. "That's hard." "That's the hardest kind." "Yes." "It doesn't make him right." "No." "But it explains him." She said this not charitably exactly, but with the precision of someone who has learned the difference between understanding and excusing, which is a distinction that takes some people entire lifetimes, and some people never quite manage. She was 6, possibly 7, and she had it. He looked down at her. "How old are you exactly?" 6, maybe 7. My grandfather wasn't sure." "Your grandfather should have kept better records." She glanced up, and for the first time he saw, clearly and unmistakably, the edge of a smile, not a small child's smile, not a performance, just the real thing, brief and dry and entirely herself. "He knew what mattered," she said. "He didn't write down everything." They walked in silence for a little while, through the corridor that smelled of old stone and the faint wood smoke from the evening fires, past the portraits of previous kings and queens who stared down from their frames with the solemn self-importance of people who knew they would be painted. Then she said, quietly, "I don't actually think you look exactly like him." "I know. You look like what I needed someone to look like, I think." She said this simply, without sentimentality, as a statement of fact about how the mind works under certain circumstances. When you need something and you find it, you recognize it by the shape of what was missing. He did not answer immediately. The corridor was warm here, the candles in their sconces, his bad knee aching as it always did toward the end of a long day, the dispatches on his desk that would wait until morning. He thought about his son, and about what was left when the things you had counted on were subtracted, and about how long it could take to notice that the space where they had been was still a space in the shape of something, and that spaces in the shape of something were still a kind of having. "Get some sleep," he said. "You too," she said, which was not quite an appropriate thing for a child to say to a king, and which he did not correct, because it was the right thing to say. At her door she stopped and turned. The lamp in the corridor caught the amber in her eyes. "Grandfather," she said. He waited. "Thank you for coming tonight." "There was never a question of not coming," he said. She held his gaze for a moment with those amber eyes, and he saw in them the same thing he had seen on the first day, in the war room, the thorough assessment, the weighing, the arrival at a conclusion. Whatever she had been looking for in his face that day, She had found it and found it again now and confirmed it. "I know," she said. "That's why I wasn't scared." She went inside. He stood in the corridor for a moment, alone with the sound of his own breathing and his bad knee, and the decades of things he was carrying, which he had learned to carry mostly without showing. Then he went to his own room, and he left the dispatches on the desk, and for the first time in a long time he slept without dreaming of Irongate. Word reached the Northern Orc Confederation 6 days later. The diplomatic summary, written by the Confederation's human liaison and transmitted in both Common and Old Orcish, described the formal war declaration, the revocation of the punitive column's authorization, and the subsequent inquiry launched under the king's direct order. It noted that the surviving child of the Marwick village attack was residing under royal protection, with full crown ward status. The response from the Confederation Council was brief. It said, "We are watching." Not as a threat, the liaison understood immediately. It was the other kind of watching, the kind that means we have not decided whether to hope, and we are watching to see if hope is warranted. Edric read the response in the war room, by the northern map, as he had sat there many times. He looked at the 3 Orc nations on that map, north and east, and what remained of the dissolved eastern territories, where 40 families had lived until 3 months ago. He looked at the human territories beside them and between them, and he thought about old wounds, and the difference between a wound that had been treated and one that had simply been covered over, and how long the difference took to become visible. He set the response down and went to find Zura, who was in the library with the tutor. He stood in the doorway until she noticed him, which did not take long. "You have a message," he said, "from the Confederation." Her face went still, the way faces go still when something large approaches. Then, "What do they say?" "They are watching." She thought about this, hands folded on her book. Then, "That's what my grandfather used to say. He'd say the worst thing is when people stop watching. When they stop watching, they've given up." He looked at her. "He was right," she said. "Yes," he said, "he was." She turned back to her book. "I'll finish the lesson, then can we walk the East Garden before the light goes?" "Yes," he said. They walked in the East Garden while the autumn light lasted, and she asked him the names of the plants, and he told her the ones he knew, and she corrected him twice with names from the Orcish botanical tradition that were more specific, and he accepted the corrections without embarrassment, which she noted in the corner of her awareness as further confirmation of what she had known from the first day. The tired kind, not the mean kind. Out on the northern map, the Confederation was watching. To the east, the inquiry was moving, name by name, toward accountability that might mean something and might not but was at least in motion. Somewhere a rock sat beside the remains of a fire that had gone cold months ago, and the smoke was long dispersed, and the only record of what had stood there was in the memory of one small girl who had watched it burn and decided, sitting very still, to keep going. She kept going. She walked in the garden and she looked at everything with those amber eyes and she asked questions until the light was gone, and when it was gone, they went inside, and she ate her dinner with the focused efficiency the kitchen had come to rely on, and she sat across from the king while he read his dispatches, and neither of them felt required to talk. The dispatches were less bad than they'd been. That was the thing about peace he had learned across 58 years. It didn't arrive, it accumulated. One dispatch at a time, one garden walk at a time, one small hand in yours in a dark corridor when you came to bring someone home. It accumulated in small facts. A child who learned your language from the inside out. A council lord who revised his position because he understood the game had changed. A northern confederation that was still watching, which meant they had not given up. He turned a page. Across the table, Zura had finished eating and was reading her lesson book with the lamp pulled close, lips moving very slightly on a new word. Her braid had come half out again. She had not noticed. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at his dispatches, and he read them, and the night went on. 3 weeks after the vote, the inquiry returned its first results. The column had been authorized by 2 names: Lord Fenwick's deputy, a man named Sorn who had been quietly building his own record of hostility toward the armistice terms, and a military subcommander named Rast, who had a history of translating loose instructions into precise violence. Rast was placed under military house arrest pending formal tribunal. Sorn resigned his position before he could be removed from it, which was a political move that Kaelan had likely advised, since it preserved most of the man's privileges while removing the most visible target. Edric read the names and filed them in the part of his mind where he kept things that were not finished. He had spent 15 years learning that accountability moved slowly when it moved at all, and that the most dangerous thing you could do was mistake motion for arrival. The inquiry was motion. It was not arrival. He would watch it. He told Zura about it in the evening, in the dining room, because she asked, and because she had the right to ask. "Will they be punished?" she said. Sorn resigned. Rast will face a tribunal. What does a tribunal do? It examines the evidence and makes a determination. Then there are consequences based on the determination. What kind of consequences? He considered how much to soften this. He decided not to. She had seen the village. She had watched the smoke. She did not need things softened. That depends on the evidence and the tribunal. Possibly significant ones. She was quiet for a moment, turning this over. Is that enough? No, he said. It probably isn't, but it's what we have. She nodded, processing this with her habitual slowness, not because she was slow, but because she was honest about the process, unwilling to rush to a conclusion before the evidence justified it. My grandfather said there's a difference between justice and justice being done, she said. He said justice is the idea of the right thing. Justice being done is the human thing, which is smaller and slower and sometimes the wrong shape. He said you had to want both without confusing them. Edric looked at her. He was a philosopher, he said. He was a farmer, she said. But he thought about things. The lamp between them was burning low. She reached over and adjusted the wick with the matter-of-fact competence she brought to small practical tasks, and the flame rose again. He watched her do it and thought about a man who had farmed and thought about things, who had raised a girl with amber eyes and a particular stillness, who had died at dawn without knowing she was sitting on a rock watching the smoke, who had not written down the year she was born because he had known what mattered, and there was not enough time to write down everything. Are you angry, he said, about the village, about what happened? She thought about this seriously. Yes, she said, but not all the time. My grandfather said anger was like a fire, useful for warmth, bad for a house. He said that. He said it a lot. A pause. I think he was angry about things for a long time, and he found a way to put it somewhere it didn't burn the house down. She looked at the lamp. I'm still working on that. So am I, Edric said. She looked up at him, then she looked back at her book. Good, she said. We can work on it together then. The first snow came in the 4th month. Zura had never seen snow before. The eastern villages were in a warmer belt, sheltered by the hills, and the winters were cold and wet but not white. She came to breakfast and looked out the east window at the garden, which had disappeared overnight into a perfect, even field of white, and she stood at the window for a long time without eating. Edric watched her from the doorway. Go look at it properly, he said. She turned around. Now. Breakfast will wait. She went outside in her coat and her boots, and she walked out into the garden, and she stood in the middle of the white field and turned around slowly, looking at everything it had changed. Then she crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the snow, which left a perfect small gray-green handprint. She looked at the handprint for a moment, and then she looked up at the gray sky, and her expression was the expression of someone receiving unexpected information about what the world contained. He watched from the doorway in his coat and did not interrupt. After a while she came back inside. Her hands were red with cold, and her braid was full of snow crystals. "Did you know it was going to do that?" she said. "Every year." "You knew and you didn't say." "I wanted you to see it yourself." She considered this, unwinding her braid to shake the snow out, and she seemed to decide it was an acceptable answer. "My grandfather would have liked to see this," she said. "Do you think so?" "He liked things that were surprising. He said the world had been made by someone who enjoyed the joke." She paused. "He said that in Orcish. I don't know if it translates exactly." "It translates well enough," Edric said. She looked at the garden one more time through the window. Then she turned back to the table and sat down and picked up her spoon, and there was the small, satisfied expression again, brief and dry and entirely herself. "Okay," she said, "breakfast." He sat down across from her and they ate, and outside the snow came down again, quiet and even, covering the garden. The Confederation's second communication arrived 2 months later. It was longer than the first. It acknowledged the inquiry and the war declaration. It noted, in careful diplomatic language, that the king's actions had been observed with interest by the Confederation Council, and that there were members of that council who wished to open a formal channel for discussion regarding certain border matters that had been left unresolved by the armistice terms. It also noted, in a single sentence at the end, that the name Zura was a traditional Eastern Orc name meaning steady or one who holds. The liaison noted he was not certain if this was intended as information or as something else. Edric read this in the war room and looked at the map for a long time. Then he folded the dispatch carefully and went to find Zura, who was in the library as usual, and he handed it to her, and she read it with the full concentrated attention she brought to texts. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My grandfather named me," she said. "He said it took him 2 days to decide." "Did he tell you why he chose it?" "He said I came into the world looking like I already knew where I was going." She folded the dispatch and handed it back. "He said some people are born running and some are born steady, and the steady ones are harder to knock down." Edric held the dispatch. "The Confederation wants to open a channel." "I heard. This is in part because of you." She considered this honestly, neither deflecting it nor claiming more than was true. "In part," she agreed. "In part because you came to the council building that night. In part because Captain Vess followed the smoke column. In part because my grandfather named me what he named me." She tilted her head. "Lots of parts." "Yes," he said, "that's usually how things change." She looked at him. "Will you open the channel?" "Yes." "Good." She turned back to her book. "I have thoughts about the border terms when it's time." He looked at her, 6 years old, possibly 7, with her undone braid and her amber eyes and her lesson book, who had walked into his palace in a borrowed page's shirt and called him grandfather and meant it before he was ready to mean it back, and who had not stopped being exactly herself for a single moment since, not under Kalen's pressure, and not in the guest room, and not sitting on a rock watching everything she had known burn down. "I'll remember that," he said. "You'll need it," she said, with a confidence that was not arrogance but simply accuracy, and went back to her reading. He went back to the war room, and the map and the dispatch. Outside in the east garden where the snow was gone now, and the first cautious green things were coming back up through the cold ground, the space where the handprint had been was long absorbed. But he knew where it had been. He thought he would always know where it had been. He opened the channel.